Harrison Blackwell stormed into his office, his jaw tight with frustration. She what? His icy blue eyes burned into his HR director, who shrank under his glare. "Your assistant quit without notice, sir," the woman repeated nervously, shifting her clipboard. "She sent an email this morning." "Effective immediately." Harrison exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. He didn't have time for this. His entire empire ran on precision, efficiency, and control, none of which included an assistant vanishing into thin air. "Find me a replacement." "We already did," the woman said, clearing her throat. "Temporarily, of course." "She's waiting outside." He barely registered the words before the door opened, and in walked a woman who was not what he expected. She was younger than any assistant he'd ever had, mid-20s at most, with waves of chestnut hair that tumbled past her shoulders. Her emerald green eyes met his without hesitation, something few dared to do. She was dressed professionally: black slacks, a fitted white blouse, but there was a spark in her gaze that told him she wasn't the type to be intimidated. "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted, extending her hand. "I'm Rowan Carter, temporary replacement." Harrison stared at her hand for a moment before shaking it briefly. "Experience?" "None as an assistant," she admitted, her voice steady, "but I'm a fast learner. I won't waste your time." His lips pressed into a thin line. This was a disaster. He didn't have time to train someone. He needed someone who could anticipate his needs before he even voiced them. "You're dismissed," he said to HR, then turned back to Rowan. "You have 1 day." "If you can't keep up, you're gone." She arched an eyebrow but nodded. "Fair enough." By noon, Harrison had thrown 3 impossible tasks at Rowan, fully expecting her to crumble. She didn't. She rescheduled a last-minute investor meeting without so much as a flinch, found his missing contract in a filing system he hadn't touched in years, and even managed to order his exact coffee without asking. By the end of the day, he was watching her with something he hadn't expected: curiosity. "I assume you're a professional magician," he muttered as she handed him a revised itinerary. Rowan grinned, leaning slightly against the doorway. "No, just observant and maybe a little stubborn." Harrison tilted his head. "Stubborn?" she shrugged. "You don't strike me as the type of man who tolerates failure." "I figured if I didn't prove myself today, I'd be out the door before I even had a chance." For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of amusement. "Smart," she smirked. "I try." The next few days passed in a blur. Rowan was quick, efficient, and had an uncanny ability to anticipate his needs before he even voiced them. He wasn't used to assistants talking back or challenging him, but she did with wit and intelligence that left him equal parts frustrated and intrigued. One evening, as she packed up her things, he caught himself watching her. "You know," he said casually, "most people are terrified of me." She glanced up, amused. "Should I be?" "That depends." "Do you plan on disappointing me?" She laughed, shaking her head. "No, Mr. Blackwell, I don't." For the first time in years, Harrison felt something unexpected, something dangerous: interest. Harrison arrived at the office earlier than usual, expecting to find the space quiet and empty. Instead, the aroma of fresh coffee greeted him, along with the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard. Rowan sat at her desk, completely absorbed in her work. A faint crease lined her forehead as she reviewed a document, her fingers flying over the keys. She hadn't noticed him yet. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You're here early." She didn't startle. Instead, she glanced up, her green eyes sharp with focus. "So are you." "I run this company," he pointed out. "And I run your schedule," she countered, setting her pen down. "You had a meeting rescheduled for later, so I figured I'd get ahead of the day." Harrison didn't respond immediately. He wasn't used to people anticipating his moves so effortlessly. It was unsettling and impressive. "Efficient," he finally said. She stretched her arms, a small grin playing at her lips. "I try." He studied her for a moment before stepping inside. "I need you to come with me tonight." Her brows lifted slightly. "For a charity gala. My assistant is expected to attend. Rowan exhaled, tapping her pen against the desk. I assume that means I'll need something formal. I took the liberty of having a dress delivered to your apartment, he said smoothly. She blinked. You what? Harrison checked his watch. It should already be there. Rowan shook her head, laughing under her breath. You really don't hear no often, do you? No, he admitted, meeting her gaze directly. And I don't intend to start now. That evening, as Harrison adjusted his cufflinks, he heard the soft click of heels behind him. He turned and everything stopped. Rowan stood in the doorway of the private lounge at the gala, wrapped in a deep emerald gown that hugged her frame perfectly. The color made her eyes even more striking, and the low back left just enough to the imagination. For the first time in a long time, Harrison was at a loss for words. She arched a brow. You're staring, he recovered quickly, adjusting his tie. I have good reason. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face before she stepped closer. I hope this event is worth the wardrobe change. Try not to sound too excited, he murmured dryly, offering his arm. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The moment they stepped into the ballroom, heads turned. Harrison was used to attention, he commanded it effortlessly. But tonight, the whispers weren't just about him. Who is she? New assistant, apparently. She must be something special. Rowan must have heard them, but if she was rattled, she didn't show it. Instead, she gave him a sidelong glance. I assume you're used to this kind of thing. Ignore them, he advised. It doesn't bother me, he believed her. The night passed in a blur of champagne, polite conversation, and strategic networking. Rowan adapted quickly, matching his pace with ease, handling introductions with an effortless charm that didn't go unnoticed. At one point, an investor leaned in, eyes twinkling. Harrison, you never bring a +1. What's changed? Before he could respond, Rowan beat him to it. He needed someone who wouldn't bore him to death. The older man roared with laughter, clapping Harrison on the back. She's a keeper. As the evening wore on, Harrison found himself watching her more than he should, and he wasn't the only one. A man approached her near the bar, offering a charming smile. I don't believe we've met. Rowan glanced up from her drink. That's probably because we haven't. Harrison was beside her in an instant, his presence unmistakable as he set down his glass with deliberate force. She's not interested. The man's smile faltered. You were just leaving, Harrison finished smoothly. The man hesitated before giving a tight nod and walking away. Rowan watched him go, then turned to Harrison, amused. That was unnecessary. He met her gaze, voice low. Was it? Something flickered in her expression, something he couldn't quite read. Instead of answering, she simply shook her head. You're impossible. For the first time in years, Harrison found himself wanting to be. Harrison had always prided himself on control. His days were structured, his decisions calculated, and his emotions locked behind an impenetrable wall. But Rowan Carter was a disruption he hadn't anticipated, and worse, he wasn't sure he minded. After the gala, something shifted between them. It was subtle at first, a glance held a second too long, a brush of hands when she passed him documents, an awareness that hadn't been there before. He told himself it was nothing. Then came the weekend business trip. Harrison's private jet was ready for takeoff, the engines humming as he settled into his seat with a file in hand. Across from him, Rowan adjusted the strap of her carry-on, her expression unreadable. This feels excessive, she noted, glancing around the spacious cabin. He didn't look up. Efficiency isn't excessive. She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. Of course you'd say that. The flight was smooth, but the air between them was anything but. Every interaction felt charged, every exchanged word carrying an unspoken weight. By the time they landed, Harrison was no closer to shaking the irritation or the attraction buzzing beneath his skin. The meeting itself was routine, but as they left the sleek conference room, Rowan pulled him aside, her voice low. You're about to make a mistake. He arched a brow, intrigued despite himself. Am I? She nodded, folding her arms. That contract you're about to sign, the supplier has a history of delayed shipments. I double-checked their recent performance reports. Harrison stared at her, his mind processing the information swiftly. He hadn't caught that not because he wasn't thorough, but because he hadn't expected his assistant to be. You're sure? She didn't flinch under his scrutiny. Completely. Without another word, he pivoted, returning to the negotiating table. Rowan followed, standing just behind him as he coolly pushed back on the terms, watching as the opposing party scrambled to explain themselves. By the time they left, with a revised and significantly better deal in hand, Harrison turned to her with something dangerously close to admiration. You just saved me millions, she shrugged, though there was a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. I told you I was observant. He studied her for a long moment. Rowan wasn't just competent, she was exceptional, and that was becoming a problem. That night, after a long workday, a dinner reservation had been made at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. It was meant to be a business dinner, just another part of the trip. But the moment she stepped into the candlelit space, wearing an understated yet effortlessly elegant dress, Harrison knew nothing about this night would be routine. The conversation was easy, the usual sharp banter softened by the glow of city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He learned things about her that weren't listed on any resume: that she once wanted to be a journalist, that she had a habit of tapping her fingers when deep in thought, that she carried an old, worn notebook filled with ideas she never shared. In turn, she asked questions no one else dared to. Do you ever get tired of it? She asked, swirling the wine in her glass. Tired of what? The endless cycle. Deals, negotiations, power moves. Harrison considered that. No one had ever asked him that before. It's what I built my life around, he answered, watching her carefully. That's not what I asked. He could have brushed it off, could have redirected the conversation the way he always did. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. Sometimes. She didn't look surprised. Instead, a knowing look crossed her face like she had already guessed it. Then why keep doing it? Because stopping isn't an option. She tilted her head, considering him for a long moment. Maybe it should be. The thought lingered long after dinner ended, after they returned to the hotel where separate rooms awaited them, after he lay awake staring at the ceiling, unsettled in a way he didn't entirely understand. By the time they returned to the office on Monday, he had convinced himself it was nothing. Then came the moment that shattered that illusion. A rival firm had extended an offer, one that could take Rowan away from his company. The news reached him in the form of a casual mention from another executive, but it hit him like a gut punch. He found her in the office kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. You got another job offer. She paused, then glanced at him. Word travels fast. He stepped closer, his voice controlled but edged with something raw. Are you taking it? She exhaled, setting her cup down. I haven't decided. That wasn't good enough. They can't offer you what I can, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Rowan blinked, caught off guard. Harrison, stay. The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of a command, a plea, and something far more dangerous. She studied him, searching his face for something he wasn't sure he was ready to name. This isn't just about work, is it? She asked softly. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. For the first time in his life, Harrison Blackwell was on the verge of losing control. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted it back. Harrison had spent his entire career ensuring that nothing and no one had power over him. Yet as he stood in his office, staring at Rowan, he realized she had unraveled every rule he lived by without even trying. She was waiting for an answer, watching him with eyes that had become impossible to ignore. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, threatening to force words from his lips he had never spoken to anyone. but she beat him to it. "I don't want to leave." Her voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it. "But I can't stay if it means pretending this is just another job." His pulse kicked up. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, wasn't accustomed to someone stripping away all the layers of pretense and forcing him to face what was in front of him. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. "You think I want to pretend?" His voice was lower than he intended, rough with something unfamiliar. She searched his face, her breath catching slightly. "I don't know what you want." That was the problem. He hadn't known either, until now. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, he reached for her. The moment their mouths met, the world around them ceased to exist. Rowan's hands moved to his shirt, gripping the fabric as if she needed something to hold onto. The kiss was urgent, unrestrained, a culmination of every unspoken word, every stolen glance, every moment of tension that had been building between them. Harrison wasn't gentle, he didn't know how to be with her. His fingers tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, desperate to make her understand that this was not something fleeting, not something he could walk away from. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Rowan's hands were still fisted in his shirt, her eyes wide with something that looked dangerously close to hope. Harrison cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "This was never just a job to me." A shaky laugh escaped her. "You have a terrible way of showing it." He exhaled sharply, pressing his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this." She smiled, and for the first time, he realized how much he needed to see that expression directed at him. "Then we'll figure it out." He had spent years believing love was a weakness, that attachments were distractions he couldn't afford. But standing there, holding Rowan, he realized he had never been more powerful than he was in that moment. Because for the first time in his life, he finally had something worth fighting for. The next few weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and late nights filled with whispered conversations. They kept things private for now. Harrison wasn't the kind of man who cared about gossip, but this wasn't just about him. Rowan was still new to this world, still navigating the weight of what it meant to be at his side. But despite their best efforts, the shift between them did not go unnoticed. At a board meeting, one of his senior executives made a passing comment about his assistant being particularly well-informed about his schedule, and Harrison had to fight the urge to shut it down with a glare alone. Rowan, to her credit, remained composed. But later, when they were alone in his office, she leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "This isn't going to stay a secret forever." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Do you want it to?" She hesitated. "No," something in his chest eased. "Then we won't," she exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "It's just, I've worked so hard to be taken seriously. I don't want people assuming I got here because of us." Harrison stood, stepping around the desk until he was in front of her. "Anyone who thinks that doesn't deserve to be in this company." Her lips curved slightly. "You always have an answer, don't you?" He brushed his fingers along her jaw. "Only when it comes to you." A week later, they attended another gala, this time with no pretense. When they arrived, Harrison made no effort to keep his distance, his hand resting at the small of her back as they navigated the event. The whispers started immediately, but he didn't care. At one point, a reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Blackwell, rumors have been circulating about your relationship with your assistant. Care to confirm?" Harrison didn't hesitate. He turned to Rowan, taking her hand, and in front of the entire room, pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to her knuckles. "She's not just my assistant," he said, his voice carrying through the crowd. "She's the only thing in my life I refuse to let go of." Rowan's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around his. The reporter blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "So you're confirming the relationship?" Harrison met Rowan's gaze, his lips twitching slightly. "I don't think there's any doubt left." The next morning, headlines were everywhere. Harrison Blackwell's secret romance no longer a secret, the millionaire CEO and his assistant more than just business. Rowan held up her phone, shaking her head as she read the article aloud. Well, subtlety was never your strong suit, Harrison smirked, pulling her against him. Remind me, did you want me to be subtle? She laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. No, he kissed her slow and deep, savoring the way she melted into him. Harrison Blackwell had built an empire, had spent his life ensuring nothing could shake him. But Rowan Carter had walked into his world and changed everything, and he wouldn't have it any other way. The morning after their relationship became public, Rowan arrived at the office expecting the usual routine. What she didn't expect was the complete shift in atmosphere. People stared, some subtly, others openly. Conversations hushed when she walked past, only to resume in whispers once she was a few steps away. Even the executive assistants, who had been nothing but professional before, exchanged glances when she entered the break room. She ignored it, keeping her back straight as she poured coffee. She had worked too hard to let other people's opinions shake her. But when she turned, Harrison was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, simply took the coffee cup from her hands and placed it on the counter. Then, without a word, he laced his fingers through hers and led her down the hall. They walked past rows of desks, past employees who pretended not to watch, past senior executives who had suddenly found their emails fascinating. Harrison didn't acknowledge any of them. When they reached his office, he shut the door behind them. Rowan crossed her arms. So, is this where you tell me I should have taken the other job? Harrison leaned against his desk, studying her. Do you want to? She narrowed her eyes. You know I don't. Then stop acting like this changes anything. She let out a breath. It does change things, Harrison. You might not care what people say, but I still have to walk through this office every day and deal with the fallout. His gaze didn't waver. Anyone who questions your place here is welcome to leave. Rowan shook her head, exasperation flickering across her face. You can't fire half the company just because they gossip. I can, actually. She let out a short laugh despite herself. That's not how this works. Harrison pushed off the desk and closed the space between them. I know you didn't sign up for this, and I know that you're capable of handling it. But if anyone makes you feel like you don't belong, I need to know. Something softened in her expression then, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. I can handle whispers, Harrison. I just don't want people thinking I didn't earn my place here. His fingers brushed against her wrist, his touch deliberate. No one who matters would ever think that. Her pulse steadied. He had a way of cutting through the noise, of making everything else feel irrelevant when he looked at her like that. Finally, she exhaled. I guess I'll just have to prove them wrong. A flicker of something like pride crossed his face. You already have. Despite the initial whispers, Rowan refused to let the office tension define her. If anything, she worked harder, more determined than ever to show that her position wasn't contingent on her relationship with Harrison. She handled negotiations with brutal efficiency, caught errors in reports that others missed, and streamlined internal operations in a way that left even the senior executives scrambling to keep up. By the end of the week, the murmurs had shifted from gossip to grudging respect. It wasn't until Friday evening that Harrison finally pulled her away from work. He arrived at her desk just as she was reviewing yet another contract. Without preamble, he plucked the document from her hands and set it aside. She raised an eyebrow. I wasn't done with that. You are now. Before she could protest, he took her coat from the back of her chair and helped her into it, his hands lingering at her shoulders for a moment longer than necessary. She sighed. Are you kidnapping me? He didn't answer, just guided her toward his private elevator. When they emerged onto the rooftop of a high rise she didn't recognize, the entire city stretched out before them, glittering in the night. A private table was set beneath soft golden lights, the kind that made everything feel impossibly intimate. Rowan turned to him, suspicious. "You planned this?" Harrison slid his hands into his pockets. "I don't like surprises, but I thought you might," she laughed, shaking her head. "You're impossible. You say that a lot, because it's true." But she let him pull out her chair, let herself sink into the moment, let herself acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely immune to grand gestures. As the evening stretched on, conversation flowed as easily as the wine. They talked about everything and nothing, about the places Rowan wanted to visit, about the rare moments Harrison allowed himself to step away from work. It wasn't until dessert arrived that he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table between them. A key. Rowan stared at it, then back at him. He met her gaze without hesitation. "Move in with me," her breath caught. "Harrison, I know it's fast," he admitted. "But I don't want to waste time pretending I don't know exactly what I want." She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because it felt like stepping over an invisible line when she hadn't been ready to acknowledge before. Harrison leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "I don't do things halfway, Rowan, you know that." She did. She also knew that despite every warning she had given herself, despite every logical reason to take things slow, she wanted this. Finally, she picked up the key, turning it over in her fingers before sliding it into her purse. Harrison's lips curved slightly. "That a yes?" she exhaled. "It's a you're insufferable, but yes." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. "Good." And just like that, the final wall between them crumbled. In the weeks that followed, Rowan adjusted to her new reality. She woke up to the scent of coffee already brewed, to Harrison reading through business reports at the kitchen counter, to stolen kisses before they left for work. She learned that despite his ruthless efficiency in business, he had a habit of leaving his ties draped over random furniture, that he preferred his whiskey neat, but took his coffee with exactly 1 sugar, that he slept deeply, but always woke the moment she moved. And Harrison, he learned that Rowan talked in her sleep sometimes, that she had an oddly specific love for thunderstorms, that she always double-checked the locks before going to bed, that she hummed under her breath when she was deep in thought. Their lives intertwined seamlessly, as if this had been inevitable all along. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of his penthouse, Rowan leaned into his side, her head resting against his shoulder. "Still think stopping isn't an option," she murmured. Harrison's arm tightened around her. "Stopping?" She tilted her head to look up at him, her expression teasing. "The endless cycle. Deals, negotiations, power moves." He considered that, his gaze lingering on her. Then, without hesitation, he pressed a slow kiss to her temple. "For you," his voice was softer than usual, but no less certain. "Anything is an option." And for the first time in his life, Harrison Blackwell knew that there was something more important than power, more valuable than any deal. Because Rowan Carter hadn't just stolen his heart. She had become the only thing in his world that truly mattered. The transition from working together to sharing a home had been surprisingly smooth, but there were still moments when Rowan found herself pausing, trying to grasp how much had changed in such a short time. She'd gone from being a temporary assistant to the woman standing beside one of the most powerful men in the city. And while she had never doubted her own capabilities, the shift in her personal life was something she was still adjusting to. Harrison, for all his intensity in the boardroom, had a way of making it seem effortless. He never hesitated, never second-guessed. If he wanted something, he pursued it with the same precision he applied to every aspect of his empire. And right now, she was that something. Late one evening, she found herself curled up on the couch in his penthouse, reviewing a proposal while Harrison stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, speaking into his phone. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was a tension in his shoulders that told her the conversation wasn't an easy one. She didn't pry. If he wanted to tell her, he would. When he finally ended the call, he didn't turn around right away. Instead, he remained facing the city skyline, his hands braced on the window ledge. Rowan set her papers aside and stood, crossing the room until she was beside him. "Bad news?" she asked. He exhaled slowly, an old competitor trying to make a move. "Nothing I can't handle." She studied his expression, noting the slight crease in his brow. "You don't have to handle everything alone, you know." His gaze flicked to her, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "I always have." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Maybe it's time to change that." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, his grip tightened around hers, a silent acknowledgement that he understood what she was offering. The next morning, she arrived at the office earlier than usual, wanting to get ahead of the day. As she settled in, one of the senior executives approached her desk. There was nothing overtly hostile about his demeanor, but there was something in his tone that made her pause. "I assume you've heard about the pushback from the board," he said, watching her carefully. She met his gaze evenly. "I have." He hesitated before continuing. "Some of them are concerned about your position here, about whether it compromises Harrison's judgment." Rowan had expected this eventually. What she hadn't expected was the quiet confidence that settled over her as she responded. "If they're questioning my abilities, they're welcome to look at my track record," she said. "I've done more in the last few months than some of them have in years." His expression flickered, but he didn't deny it. Before he could say anything else, a voice interrupted. "I'd be careful about where this conversation is heading." Harrison's presence was unmistakable. He hadn't raised his voice, but the weight behind his words was undeniable. The executive straightened, clearing his throat. "I was only expressing concerns raised by the board." Harrison's eyes darkened. "Rowan's position here isn't up for discussion. Anyone who thinks otherwise is free to find employment elsewhere." The man gave a quick nod before retreating. Rowan turned toward Harrison, raising an eyebrow. "You know I can fight my own battles." He studied her, his expression softening just slightly. "I know. But that doesn't mean I'll let anyone question what you've earned." Warmth spread through her chest, but she kept her tone light. "You do realize you just terrified half the office, right?" He didn't look remotely concerned. "Good." Later that evening, Harrison had another surprise waiting for her. Instead of heading home after work, he led her to a sleek black car waiting outside. She slid into the passenger seat, giving him a curious glance. "Where are we going? You'll see." The drive was quiet, the city lights blurring past as they moved further away from the towering skyscrapers. When they finally arrived, Rowan stepped out and took in their surroundings. A private villa nestled on the edge of the water, with soft lanterns illuminating the pathway. The air smelled of salt and jasmine, a sharp contrast to the usual scent of the city. Harrison held out his hand. "Come on." She took it, letting him lead her inside. The space was warm and inviting, a stark difference from the modern precision of his penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the view of the ocean, and a private terrace overlooked the waves. Rowan turned to him, realization dawning. "This is yours," he nodded. "I bought it years ago. Never had a reason to come here much." She glanced around, taking in the subtle details, the untouched books on the shelves, the perfectly maintained but rarely used furniture. Something in her chest tightened. "You brought me here for a reason." He didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped closer, his hands settling on her waist. "I wanted you to see a part of my life outside of all of it. The business, the pressure, the expectations." She swallowed, her fingers resting lightly against his chest. "And what is this part?" His gaze held hers, steady and unguarded. "The part I only want to share with you." Her breath hitched, but before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her pulse jumped. Harrison had never been a man who wasted time. When he made a decision, he followed through with certainty. He opened the box, revealing a ring, a single emerald stone surrounded by delicate diamonds. Rowan's heart pounded. "I don't want to wait," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to waste another second pretending I could ever go back to a life that doesn't have you in it." She stared at him, at the man who had once been nothing more than an impossible boss, at the man who had become everything. A million thoughts swirled in her mind, but only one mattered. She reached for the ring, her fingers brushing against his. "Yes," the word left her lips before she had time to second-guess it. Harrison slid the ring onto her finger, his grip tightening around her hand like a silent promise. And when he kissed her, slow and deep, Rowan knew there was no going back. This wasn't just another chapter in her life. It was the beginning of forever.